Vikings had a strong effect on the English language. But how did that effect come to be? Vikings both assimilated and were fought off by the English and Scottish, leading to different dialects within the language. Here's where we'll explain how they did that, as well as the Vikings' influence on Old English. Many of England's dialects have been influenced by the Vikings of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. England became an easy target for Vikings after it was split into a heptarchy by the Anglo-Saxons during the 9th and 10th centuries. Some area let the Vikings assimilate, whereas others fought them off, leading to different dialects where there was and was not Viking influence. In areas where Vikings assimilated, they established bases by the 9th century for permanent settlement. Vikings quickly assimilated through religion and marriage. Such assimilation created a hybrid language of Old English and Old Norse evidenced by place names. Many Scottish place names have Scandinavian influence. Vikings were also, in some cases, beneficial to societies. One example is the Pictish society, where Vikings may have even been welcomed as protection against the Picts and Gaels of mainland Scotland. Vikings also influenced development of rural hinterlands by establishing trade centers. In fact, towns such as York were not civilized before Viking intervention due to a lack of previous urban development. In places where their influence was less welcome, Vikings took land from native population to farm. Vikings even drove out previous inhabitants, such as in Shetland and Orkney. England had to create an army for defense. Kings took a tax called Danegeld to support the army and navy. Regional armies organized or created resistance in the 9th century. England built walls around their towns and founded the navy in 1875. Viking takeovers of some societies were much easier due to declines from disease and civil war. The last great Viking invasion was 1066, when the Norwegian invasion challenged the new Anglo-Saxon king for the English crown. The first Norwegian king was defeated, but another Viking successfully invaded England, ending the Viking Age.
During the late 8th century, Vikings came from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Later on, Alfred the Great rose to the throne in 871, and Vikings began to settle down in England. Old Norse in England was only spoken, geographically spread, and long-lived. Old Norse was the first formed language of a substantial immigrant community. Settled Norse speakers were found in England from 1870s onward. Over time, Viking consonants began to replace Old English sounds. Modern English sounds taken from Old Norse include the hard G sound like egg and the hard K sound like kid. Moreover, pronouns and verbs forms also changed to the Old Norse forms. Originally, third-person singular and plural were extremely similar in the form in Old English. Modern third-person pronouns are from Old Norse origin, like they, them, and their, and this helped people distinguish the subject of conversations, thus making the language easier. One thing that allowed Old Norse to embed itself further into the English language was that natives perceived Vikings as distant relatives. Vikings were of Germanic origin, so Old English and Old Norse were incredibly similar languages. It allowed Norse settlers to assimilate easily with English residents after their initial violent period. Many words and forms adopted into the English language. In addition, there was intermingling between both language groups, including intermarriages, and then their children would learn English first, causing the English language to evolve. A majority of Vikings were lower-class farmers and merchants, opposed to upper-class rulers and authorities. This meant that Old Norse became part of English and not the other way around, since there wasn't enough authority for a major language switch to happen. Proof of the intermingling of the two languages also exists in word equivalents. Old Norse borrowing stood alongside their English equivalents. A modern example would be like rear a child in English and raise a child in Norse. Other examples are like wish and want, craft and skill, and hide and skin. Vikings gave the English language another dimension, more light and shade, and more variety. Many new words worked their way into Old English, but the words did not officially appear to be part of the English language until the words appeared on writing and part of everyday conversation. As this graph shows, the words did not show up until way after the Vikings came. The new words only came into documentation once written down.
English underwent a number of dramatic changes during the Viking invasions, especially to the grammar of the language. While these changes have often been attributed to French and the Norman invasion, they are in fact a result of Norse influence. The grammatical changes between Old and Middle English included a loss of grammatical genders and a wide variety of suffixes, such as those indicating cases. For instance, Old English had the 3 genders found in all Germanic languages, but by the time of Middle English, the endings which had indicated these genders had disappeared. In German, for instance, forks, spoons, and knives all have a different article, die, der, and das, In English, meanwhile, all have the same article, the. Genders are found in all Indo-European languages except for English. Case endings were also mostly lost in the transition between Old and Middle English. This trend has continued into modern English, where the genitive apostrophe s is the only surviving case marker. This table of case markers, case endings in Old and Middle English, as well as modern English, and as you can see, the endings fade between the two forms of the language. It is believed that this occurred as less emphasis was put on the case endings, and the vowels eventually became simple sounds. This is also true of verb forms, which were substantially simplified from their earlier forms. For instance, the infinitive ending, n, in Old English was dropped, and number and person were no longer changed in all forms. This eventually led to the situation in modern English, where the only differing form is the third person singular. As you can see, this wide variety of forms is still present in modern German, while it has disappeared in English. German has been used as a point of comparison, as is a fairly typical Germanic language, as was Old English. Another important grammatical change was the shift from phrases such as I go myself to I go. While these phrases are still present in English, they are found very rarely, such as to perjure oneself. These phrases are still found in all Romance and Germanic languages except for English, and are usually required for the sentence to be grammatically correct. English also nearly lacks a generic pronoun for person. While one is usable and correct, usually you, the second person form, is used instead, while in other Germanic languages there is always the generic pronoun man. Again, in Old English, the man was still present.
In short, the Norse invasions had a massive impact on both English and England. These Viking invasions had a variety of effects, including both new words, but also radically different grammatical structure. The influence of Norse on English led to a much more modern form of the language, with the various aspects that make English one of the stranger Indo-European languages. The Norse invasions resulted in a substantial change in England, with the establishment of the Danelaw and the establishment of cities like York as major locations. While Norse words were also integrated, such as skin and skirt, some of the most important changes came in the grammar. The loss of genders, cases, and many other special indicators came from the Norse influence on English.